Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And thank you to everyone who is here on Zoom. Um, I'm really grateful to be able to do these virtual events. As much as I would love to have been in the physical store, this is has been a really nice alternative, like a little virtual book tour. And thank you so much to Katie for being here and being in conversation with me. I'm really looking forward to it. So I'm going to read from a section in the book that takes place actually kind of near the end. And the narrator is visiting her dad in China. So I'm going to just read a few fragments. It's also worth noting that the novel is written as like a series of vignettes. So I'll read a few of those from two parts in that section. He takes me to all of his spots. We walk all of his neighborhood walks. He introduces me to everyone. The market grandma and grandpa, the fruit stand lady and her son, the tea auntie, the trinket stall uncle, the cold noodle couple. Each time he talks and talks, showing me off. And each time I stand up straight. This girl knows how to stand, the Chinese teachers used to say, but that was only for them. The rest of the time, I hunched wildly. I want to convey to these people so badly, look, this crazy old man has a decent, high-functioning daughter. It is impossible for me to find shoes in China that fit. They are all either too narrow or too short. At a shoe store, I ask my dad to ask the owner if he has a pair of combat-style boots in one size up. The store owner shakes his head and says the ones I'm holding are the largest available. Try on the men's boots, says my dad, who then tells the store owner that what I think is the equivalent in Cantonese, a language I understand none of. I shake my head. No, it's okay. When I notice the store owner looking down at my feet, I try to cover them with my hands. It's a biological wonder that I can look so like everyone in China, but have such average American limbs. Maybe it was something I ate growing up. All that hormone-injected cow's milk and cheese, says my dad. On the news, a landslide in a nearby city engulfs 22 buildings of an industrial park. The hopeless faces of those digging through the rubble with their hands looking for what's gone missing. They toss aside pieces of fallen building. The reporter walks up to a section of wall and points out a structural problem. The camera zooms in and we can see that between the concrete of the walls are crushed food cans that have been used as support. I pick out a few words, poor and people and sorry. My dad translates. This world is fucked. Everybody is cutting corners. I'm just happy I won't be alive to see the troubles that will hit in your time. Are you feeling lucky? My dad asks. The question is a trick, or an entrance to a vast, complicated maze I have no choice but to enter. The first days of bonding and reunion have given way to the old paths, the ingrained behaviors, the past pains and irritations. I am exhausted and snap at him. Not really, why? You better start feeling lucky then, and watch your tone. We walk farther until he stops and says, here we go. It is a small booth. The lower section, a glass case full of various colored paper items decorated with Chinese faces and characters. The man inside sits on a plastic crate, a cat on his lap, listening to some sort of talk radio. My dad says something in Cantonese, hello, or maybe, how's it going, or quite possibly, hey old man, it's me. The man stands up, the cat scampers up and out of the booth, down the street. I watch it go. This is my buddy, the lotto man, my dad says. His buddy, the lotto man, nods carelessly in my direction. The man has yellow fingertips, which are now wrapped around a dark bottle with a gold cap. You see, my dad says, just like I told you. Every time I come here, he makes me drink wine with him. These are my bars in Zhuhai. He sweeps his arm, which spans the entire booth. The lotto man pours amber liquid into 3 small cups, then gestures for me to pick one up. I do. He says something to my dad and laughs. What's he saying? He says you don't look very happy, so drink. We clink our cups. The men pour their drinks down their throats, shot style. I sniff at the stuff and take a sip. It is bitter and strong, and I wince. It is definitely not wine as I understand wine, but my dad has called it wine. Another trick. It's liquor, I say. This is Chinese medicinal wine. That's the name, he says. You don't have to finish. So I do, and I feel the heat rise inside me. The lotto man's mouth moves. I watch his body closely, desperate to glean meaning out of where his toes point, how far he leans forward, the placement of his arms, the twitch of his eyebrow. After a few minutes, I'm certain he's tired of my dad's constant talking. I forgot or did not remember fully how much he truly talks. I don't think 5 minutes of silence have passed without him telling another story from his past, complaining about something or another, going over the mundane details of this or that. He's always talking to anybody and everybody, even if they don't want to hear it. Let's go, I say. I'm hungry. I pull at my dad's elbow, but the two men exchange a few more words. The lotto man laughs and slaps my dad on the shoulder. So maybe I'm wrong. Maybe he wants to keep chatting. Maybe he likes my dad. Maybe they really are buddies. The lotto man says it's too bad you can't understand or speak. But it's okay. You can pick it up in a couple weeks. You'll remember. Chinese is inside you. That's what people keep saying, but where exactly is it? Before he can answer, another man walks up with a small toddler. This new man lifts the boy onto a chair in front of the lotto booth. The boy stares at me with the sullen expression of a tired child I understand well. My dad reaches for the boy's face and pats his cheek several times while saying something in a stern voice. The boy's eyes widen and he half opens his mouth, showing his tiny white teeth and pink tongue. He glances toward his own father for reassurance or for guidance or to tattle, but his father is not paying attention. I pull my dad away from the booth, away from the poor boy. Why did you do that? I ask, when we are far away enough not to be heard, though I'm not sure why I worry. It's so unlikely here that anyone will understand our exchange. Hey, stop pulling me. Watch it, young lady, he says. It's fine to pat a child's cheek. It's the head you can't pat, like a dog. That's bad luck. The cheek is okay. It's good. He understands. Kids, everywhere I go, they stare at me. So I tell them, I told this one, I told him to behave. Be a good boy. If he's a good boy, he'll have good fortune and success. He knows now. He's lucky. Think about that. Get it? The last time we spent this much time together was when I was 13 and he took me to Europe. On what money, I'm not sure. During the trip, we were always interacting with strangers late into the nights. He never had a hard time finding locals who would take us around. He was glamorous and in control, while I often felt awkward and ugly. And the whole trip, he was giving me lessons and testing me, as though each challenge would make me stronger. Go buy the train tickets, ask that woman for a restaurant recommendation, play checkers with this man at the park, pick a hotel, and book the room. Once, at a bar in Barcelona, after I returned from the bathroom, he and our guides of the night were gone. I walked around the place in search of him, panicking. I went outside, but he wasn't there. What will you do if you find yourself alone? I could hear him saying. How will you handle the situation? I went around the crowded block a few times. Concerned people spoke to me in Spanish, but I shook my head and kept walking. It occurred to me that he may have truly abandoned or forgotten me, or that something terrible had happened to him, or that I'd entered an alternate reality. But when I returned to the bar, there he was outside, calm and casual, chatting with the strangers. He waved me over. Did you have a nice walk? He asked. Where were you? Why'd you leave me alone? I didn't leave you alone. I knew where you were the whole time. I was watching you. No, you weren't. I didn't see you. The group of them laughed. Oh, yes, we followed you as you marched around the streets, one stranger said, doing a drunken impression of my stride. Your papa is a funny man. I felt idiotic and crazed, but held back my tears. My daughter is very mature and independent, though, isn't she? He said to the strangers and wrapped his arm around my shoulder. Yes, they all said. She handled herself very well, like an adult. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Alexandra, thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
That was really such a pleasure to hear you read in a strangely intimate but disembodied Zoom room. As I think you said at the start of the event, we thought we'd be doing this in person, and instead we're doing it online. But in a funny way, your book actually speaks very well to the moment, in that it's a book about precarity, a book about displacement and isolation. And I wondered, how does a book feel to you now when you look at it in this new context? Do you see the book any differently?
I guess I'm not sure that I see it differently so much that I'm like, oh wow, this narrator is so lonely in the book and feels so isolated, and now I kind of feel that as well. Whereas before, the narrator felt really like distant to me, and now I feel like maybe we're like aligning again in this moment, or like our feelings are aligning again.
I mean, you write really very strikingly about the kind of precarity of the gig economy in particular,
Mm-hmm.
and I wonder, now that's something that I think, you know, in a way, I think the best books, when we say they speak to the moment, is because they've seen something that was really already brewing in the culture, in the society. So in terms of that, in terms of that precarity, you were writing this book. It's actually set in the early 2010s, if I'm right, in terms of its observations about technology and online culture. How have those played out for you, kind of now?
Yeah, that's true. I'm. It is interesting to see how people who are working in like the gig economy and who don't have like, you know, full-time jobs with benefits and paid sick leave and paid time off, like, are the ones who are the most affected and hurt by the pandemic. And that was something that, you know, obviously I never predicted in writing my own book, but it is an issue that I wanted to explore, just as someone, especially who has worked as a contract employee, as like a freelancer, and uh, has experienced that level of precarity where there's this sense that like anybody could replace you in your job. And the narrator in my book, in that position, thinks like, oh, I'm going to work harder, I'm going to prove myself, and then somehow I'll make myself invaluable and somebody will notice me and give me the raise that I deserve, or give me the benefits that I deserve. But ultimately she finds like, no, that's not true. They see her as replaceable. They see her as just like somebody who can like do the work for the time being, and as soon as that she doesn't want to, they just like bring somebody else in. So that is something that I've been thinking about a lot more now, about the kinds of people who are deemed, who we are saying are quote unquote essential, but aren't given like the essential benefits that like somebody who just like is working deserves. Yeah, that was a rambly way of saying like
No, I think
it's
one of the things that your book, I mean, I am the children of Japanese immigrants, and I grew up in a household where Japanese was the primary language. But my Japanese is shaky, and there was a lot in the book that really rung true to my own experience. And I grew up in Davis, actually. I don't know if
wait, really?
yeah, I did. I did. I
My
grew up in
family lives in Davis.
No, well, I wondered if that,
Can we
because
talk about this?
I mean, kind of have to talk about it because it's so perfectly eerily evoked, even though, I mean, obviously I'm older than you, so it's this time lag, but I was like, my God, she's totally 100% captured this place. Um, but one thing I was really struck by in your book is how kind of elegantly and movingly you talk about visibility and invisibility, and being able to speak and not being able to speak. And that's in a lot of different contexts. Obviously, your narrator moves from California to the East Coast and then to China, and then in the section you just read, she's in Spain. But nonetheless, it seems like this is a kind of ongoing theme that you explored, both I think in terms of the economics of the gig economy or of being female, but also in terms of race. But we can talk about Davis too. We want to do that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I do want to talk about Davis because that's like an interesting place that I also see as like a parallel place to Ithaca, just like that small college town vibe. But yeah, like even in like rereading that section, I was thinking about like how there are so many different scenarios and circumstances where the narrator isn't able to sort of like access language in the way that she wants to, whether that's like a form of self-silencing in the workplace where she thinks like, oh, I can't ask for certain things right now, or I've already asked once and it was ignored, so now I'm going to self-silence myself, or in her relationship where she feels like she can't talk about certain things without it getting too fraught, or and then in the section that I read when she literally doesn't have like access to the language that her father is speaking with the people around her. And I do think that language is like, and having that ability to speak, whether or not, you know, it's in this situation of like the office or in a relationship or in a different country, that's like a form of visibility. And when she doesn't feel like she has access to it, she feels invisible in a lot of ways. Yeah. So that's like something that I wanted to explore in the book. And actually, like in your talking about it made me realize like, oh, there are like a lot of different ways where um, she isn't able to feel visible through language. But yeah, Davis is. Oh yeah, sorry. No, before we talk about Davis, please go ahead.
I mean, I guess I was curious, and I'm wary of kind of overinterpretation. But to what extent was the fragmented form that you chose for the novel a kind of way of expressing that? I think, you know, there is a kind of white space around the words. There's a sense that things that are occluded or that aren't quite on the page is really powerful in the novel and very moving. And is that in any way related? Did that come about very naturally, or is that in any way related to this idea of what access to language she has, both internally and publicly as well? Because that's one of the interesting things about her, is there's what she's able to say in the public arena, there's what she's able to say in her relationship, there's what she's able to say to herself, and then there's the things that she can't say to herself, even on some level.
Yeah. The fragmented form and the vignettes, like that came naturally, probably before I even realized what the book was going to be about. But the more I worked on it, I think the more I saw the potential for the form to dramatize those kinds of conflicts and tensions around like visibility, invisibility, but also around her struggle to find a sense of self. It's like this feeling of, you know, achieving like a small moment of peace, or maybe even like a small moment of realization where she like, for example, realizes like she's never going to get a raise at work. But then she lapses back into like shame and doubt and confusion. And I think that the form is good for dramatizing those like that like push and pull between like those feelings. And the white space also like functions well for like, you know, just representing silence too. Like another example is like when she is about to talk to her boyfriend about like race, or they're about to have like some conversation where she feels like, oh, maybe we'll have some kind of understanding about race in our relationship, and then oftentimes those conversations like drop off into a white space and the topic is changed. Yeah, but I do think that like that interpretation of the fragments has come to me like more like more in the post-writing phase. I don't know that like I was very conscious of it when it was happening, even though like I did go into it with like certain intentions in terms of like mood or tone or feeling. But maybe I don't think I was like interpreting it like while it was happening so much.
So I mean, Davis. I mean, I loved so many things about your book, but as I said, it's very close to my own experience of growing up in Northern California, and I was wondering, you know, there's such a rich history of the California novel, as we all know, but of course, you know, the history of the Asian American experience on the West Coast is very, very fraught, and
Right.
from the Chinese Exclusion Act to internment. And so I just wondered, you know, when writing about California, which I've actually never done, and John Freeman actually asked me at one point, "Do you consider yourself a California novelist?" And I said, I don't think I do because I've never written about California. But I wondered, what is California to you? You know, there was so much truth, and it was very unflinching, your observations about that bit of California, but there was also so much tenderness and affection, and I found it incredibly moving. But yeah, California for you as a writer.
Thank you for saying all of that. Before I go into it though, I was wondering like when you lived in Davis, how old were you when you moved out of Davis?
I
Did you go to Davis
I
High?
was No, I went to
Okay.
Emerson Junior High School. That's what it was.
Me
Was it
too.
still there? I went. I mean, I think I moved to Marin County when my family moved when I was maybe 11 or 12. But my
Okay.
mom still lives in Davis.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so you know, and in the house that I grew up in, and my dad taught at the university, and yeah, I mean, it's a place that does occupy a lot of space in my imagination for sure.
Yeah, I moved to Davis when I was 11, like, or just about to turn 11, um, and had been living in like San Francisco and then like a short stint in Shanghai before that. But it's funny because I don't always say that I'm from Davis because I feel like, oh, well, my formative childhood years, I was in San Francisco and I was in Shanghai. But also a part of me is like, I don't want to say I'm from Davis um, because I didn't like living there when I first moved there. But obviously, I spent most of my like adolescence in Davis. But California as a whole, like, and Davis too, I I consider it home. I mean, I was born in San Francisco, and I've spent like most of my life in California. Um, and I think since I left California, it has felt like it's even more a part of my identity and like how I understand myself than ever before. And I think that's probably something that happens a lot when people move. Like suddenly the place that they left takes like takes up a huge amount of space in their psyche. And I like I relate back to California as like a way to relate back to myself too. But writing about California and writing about Davis and San Francisco, yeah, I do feel like a tenderness towards both. And like you said, the history of Asians in California is really fraught. But I think because California has this reputation for being like a very liberal and like open-minded state overall, but especially Northern California, it's an especially interesting place to write about in relation to race and in relation to like politics, because I think most of the Californians that I know consider themselves like very progressive, and because of that, maybe don't uh, think more critically about like where they're messing up, or where they could improve. It's sort of like a sense of like, I'm a good person already, so isn't that good enough? and that's something that, I mean, that's not limited to California, obviously, but and that's something that I also experience, like living in another small college town. It's very indicative of like the like small college town where everyone thinks of themselves as like being progressive. But yeah, I wanted to write about a character who is, I guess, existing in those spaces and feeling conflicted about her relationships with the people in them.
Mhm. I mean, a lot of the novel kind of, to me, takes place in that kind of funny gap between who you are, if I mean, not that that's a stable thing, but assuming it's a, you know, that kind of private self and public self, and you, I I think you kind of you end up talking about that a lot through the lens of race, I think, in terms of, you know, how racial identity is constructed and how it's experienced. And I want to talk about that in a minute, but I think you kind of enter into it really through online culture and through the narrator's job at this tech magazine. It is a magazine, right? It's like a
Yeah, it's like it's a magazine and a
yeah,
website.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Through the magazine, and I just wondered this kind of question of the presentation of the self and how that works, and why the novel is particularly useful as a form to kind of think about interiority and that, and kind of occupying that gap between kind of that outer self and inner self, and how those two kind of can impact each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I find that fiction and the novel is especially like an especially good form and like tool to explore like that gap between, you know, the self, the out public self and interiority, because there's room for, I guess there's room for mystery and like the lack of a resolution. I feel like, I mean, in online culture, like, you know, social media, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, there's less of a space for the unknown, for questions, for mystery, I guess. Because each of those tools, there's like a pretty clear purpose for it, like state like a clear opinion, present like yourself as like someone who loves dogs or someone who loves food, and like have a brand. But people aren't, at least in my experience, that simple. And also, even, I mean, I don't write that much nonfiction anymore, but even in like essays, there's this impulse towards like a takeaway or a resolution. And in fiction, that's, I mean, that's what I love so much about fiction, is that there's not so much that impulse towards that, at least in the fiction that I like. It's more about the questions rather than the answers. So yeah, I think for me, like having been a tech journalist before and feeling this pressure to have a personal brand and to like present this public persona in order to gain popularity and gain clicks and gain a following, all of those things, I don't know, I didn't really enjoy them, and I found them very confusing, found it very confusing. And like the narrator, I also am not good at those things. So that was something that I wanted to explore a little bit more. I don't know. I have thought about writing a character who is really good at those things, but it's like so hard for me to access right now, like the kind of personality and psyche that would like be good at that. I wonder if like that gap between who they are like publicly and who they are privately is wider or smaller. I'm not sure.
I know. I think the same thing. I mean, I go into agonies. Like writing a tweet is extremely stressful for me, and
Yeah.
I have deep envy for people who can kind of, you know, tweet 30, 40 times a day, and it seems to be very low stress for them. Um, Obviously, this book is about what it means to be Chinese American right now. And in particular, you look at that in kind of very big public structures like the workplace, but you're also looking at it very particularly in the context of an interracial marriage, sorry, not marriage, relationship. And I just wondered if you could, it's very, it's fascinating the way the narrator kind of has this sense that the public or the kind of perception of what it means to be Asian, for example, might actually invade upon the intimacy of a private relationship. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about your decision to make that so much, in a way, the heart of the novel.
I think part of it was that I hadn't read something that explored like the messiness and the nuance of being in like this type of interracial relationship, at least between like an Asian woman and a white man. I think that like, you know, there are definitely representations of that, but nothing that I felt sort of mirrored the like the stress and the anxiety that at least as an Asian woman I have felt at times. And it's, yeah, definitely, I will say that the narrator I think of as like maybe like 20 to 50% like more obsessive and more like a little bit more neurotic than myself. But like the seeds of her questions are definitely things that I've asked myself being in a relationship with a white man. And like you said, these outside perceptions and these outside forces like definitely I don't want to say but like find their way into their intimate relationship. And that's something that I think nobody can really escape in their intimate relationships, like these societal forces like racism and sexism make their way into even like our most intimate and personal relationships. And I wanted to explore how like this particular narrator sort of reckons with that. And there are times when she gets sort of, she goes to the dark side, like really starts to question who she is in this relationship. Like, is she betraying her race for being in a relationship with a white man? Is she like brainwashed? Is she by society? And those are all questions that she asks herself, maybe not very productively. She doesn't like come up with any clear answers, but I wanted to at least like portray like somebody who is dealing with those kinds of questions. But yeah, I feel like there are like two like extremes where it's like that, like you're a race traitor for dating somebody outside of your race, and then like the other extreme, which is like, no, like love conquers all, and love sees, like love is colorblind, but like it's not either of those really in being this in this kind of relationship. And just like sort of exploring like the whole spectrum of thoughts that the narrator has.
And one of the things the narrator does in the course of thinking about that is she becomes, I think, kind of obsessed.
Yeah.
Uh, she kind of starts finding not an alternate history, but she uncovers a history of Chinese American experience, and in particular of Chinese American women or Chinese women in relationship with Caucasian men.
Mm-hmm.
But can you talk a little bit about your decision to include what I assume are actual newspaper clippings and historical figures into the novel?
Yeah, I so I took a course in my MFA program, and it was titled Historical Research and or History and Research in the Novel. And that was a class that was like, I don't know, really eye-opening to me, just probably because I really like to do research. And I was like, oh, I can just incorporate all my research into my novel. So I knew going into this book, even though I also knew that it was going to be told through just like one character's perspective, knew that I wanted some sort of historical narrative to find its way into the book. Um, And I was doing research for the novel, collecting like all of these documents. And I was like, how do I incorporate these? How do I get the narrator to like naturally like find these kinds of things? And I realized that I could just like give that sense of discovery and research that I was doing directly to the narrator. Like that was a kind of easy out for me. But it also made sense because, I mean, she's really isolated in this new place. She feels like very disconnected from who she was before she moved. And that sense of isolation is really ripe for an obsessive character who is seeking answers and not always maybe like finding narratives that have like a clear connection. I think, well, she gets very obsessed with one particular woman, Yame Kin, who is the first Chinese woman to have graduated from medical school in the United States, and that happens to be like a part of Cornell where she lives, in the town that she lives in Ithaca. And she was also married to a white man. So she starts to see these parallels, even if they're not like super clear. I think she's just like reaching for some sense of connection to people in the past in order to feel like she might be able to better understand her own relationship and what she should do going forward. And that's something that I guess I feel like I do myself, like trying to find some kind of answer from other people's lives, people who have come before. But yeah, I also felt like in this novel, oh yeah, no, sorry, go ahead. I'm like,
no, you finish.
oh no, I was just going to say like, yeah, these like histories that she's looking for are like largely lost histories, and like as someone who feels lost, I think she also feels good about like having like discovered and like finding things that she wasn't aware of before.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess this novel was really interesting to me because it is not. I don't think it didn't read to me like a piece of autofiction, but it has a very, although the narrator at one point is called quite late is named, her kind of American name is her English language name is given as Alexandra, but she's at the same time, I was very interested by what you're doing between the relationship between a kind of historical reality and the fiction of the story. And I wondered, well, I mean, would you consider it a piece of autofiction? Are you even interested in that term? How do you use the form of the novel to kind of pick away at that division between fiction and nonfiction?
I feel a little bit conflicted about the term autofiction only because do you get this question with your books, with especially A Separation? I wonder if people talked about it as
About
autofiction.
autofiction. Well, as my husband likes to say, he's not dead. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I don't think I do. Not to my face.
But yeah, no, I mean, the book and the narrator, like I drew a lot from my own life in writing this narrator and in writing this book. But I also feel like I am distant from the character and from the world of the novel. So I guess I was interested in like playing with, having a narrator who like I welcome the readers to read as like similar to me, but then also pushing back on that. There are a few moments in the book where I do that, and the instance where like the name comes up is presented as a question. I think I knew people were going to read her as like a version of myself, if not just like literally read her like me, because I've definitely gotten some feedback that's like, this is just a memoir, I don't get it. That's kind of my fear, that people will just think it's a memoir. But yeah, with autofiction, I think I am more interested in like the fictional aspect of autofiction, like where the book strays, and where the book is like playing with what we consider like truth and reality.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense,
I
I
mean,
guess.
I remember Claire Massoud had a very kind of interesting and elegant formulation about how there's a kind of autofiction that is inward looking, but there's a kind of another kind of autofiction that looks out and is in a way observational and observes the world, and in that sense is an open form. And it feels to me that your book was really doing that, particularly in the kind of, as you bring in these documents and you kind of complicate the interiority of the character. I have one last question, because I think we're probably running short on time, but a lot of my students, I teach, I teach on an MFA program, and a lot of my students are very interested in this fragmented form for the novel, for a longer piece of work. And obviously this is something that has a very long kind of history. There are many both fiction and nonfiction and genre crossing books that have used this, but the place that I think is kind of most challenging, and I haven't actually written anything in this form myself, but is finding the structure and creating the kind of through line for the reader. And this is, I suppose, a kind of unforgivably crafty question, but I just wondered, how did you find that structure? Because it is really, I mean, I was able to have both those kind of the brevity, the fragments, but I absolutely felt like I knew I was reading a novel the entire time, and I had a great kind of pull to continue reading. And I just wondered, how did you write them in sequence or in clusters, or did you go back and add things?
Thank you for saying that, because I do worry sometimes that people will feel like it's there is no through line. But yeah, I wrote them initially with no sense of like structure or order. I think that was like the first document that I had prior to even like acknowledging to myself that it was a novel. It was
Mm-hmm.
just like this document of fragments. And then after I had that, I organized them based off of place. And because I realized that, you know, the fragments were just taking place in different towns, different cities. And there was like a clear sense of actual like movement from place to place. And I also cut like a third of them at that point. And that's when I had to like start filling in the gaps and creating like more of a, you know, this book does not have a lot of plot, but creating more of a plot line in terms of like, you know, the character is here, she's going to move here, and then she's going to move there, and make these decisions. So it was a pretty haphazard process, not very efficient, and in revision moved things around a lot, and I probably could move things around forever, but it's good to have deadlines and let something go. um, yeah,
Um,
so I do think fragmented novels are difficult in revision.
mhm. Can I ask just one last question, which is that you're part of a generation of really phenomenal young Asian American female writers. Um, there's so many, and they're so brilliant. And I just wonder, is there anything in particular that is coming out now or soon that we should all be keeping an eye out for from your peers?
Yeah, I love Meng Jin's Little Gods. That came out in January. C. Pam Zhang's How Much of These Hills is Gold, which came out, I think, a week after mine. And there are a few books that are coming out in the next few months too. Isako Serizawa's Inheritors, which is that comes out in July, and it's a book of sort of like linked stories slash chapters. I don't think she's calling it a story collection or a novel. It sort of like exists outside of that either form. And I'm also really looking forward to oh shoot, I'm sorry, I like forget how to pronounce her last name, but she wrote this book called A Burning, and I think that's coming out in June. I haven't read it yet, but I'm looking forward to it.
I'm writing these.
And I think that John is putting links to a bunch of books And I also read Kevin Wing's New Waves. He's not a woman, but
Yeah,
that was also a really interesting book to read.
great. Thank you
Yeah.
so much. I don't know if
Thank
now there's
you.
a way to do questions, or
I do have,
I'm looking
I
at
do
the
have
square.
one question. There was another question from Nicole, which was sort of answered in your discussion about autofiction, about whether there was anything especially important from your actual experience that you wanted to maintain or put into the novel. And she said, I really love the book, having grown up in the Bay Area in San Francisco and attending UC Davis.
Nice. Yeah, I think I mean, I knew that I wanted to write about being a tech journalist. That was something that like I definitely wanted to maintain in the book. And then also writing about like places like Davis and San Francisco and Ithaca, places that I've lived, which details are altered from my actual experience. A lot, like too many to name. So yeah, there are characters and experiences that like never actually happened to me. Thank goodness for the novel and fiction for the ability to do that. I got a private question from somebody. Current tech journalist over here. Are you happy that you aren't covering the chaos right now? Or have you thought about going back? I'm very happy to not be covering tech right now. So yeah, so crazy. And you know, like once every few months, I'll think about going back because I'm like, oh, a job, like a steady job, and something that I can do, like, you know, 8+ hours a day. And then I remember, like, oh no, I didn't really enjoy it that much. I do think that that's also has to do with like the fact that I was in consumer tech, and I do think that there are other aspects of tech journalism that are you know, much more enjoyable. And I respect tech journalists for sure.
And it looks like another one just came in. You do a great and meticulous job rendering neurotic thought while making it engaging and very fun to read. Can you speak on that kind of writing, the writing of neuroses?
Thanks, Nana, for that question. Uh, I think for me, that kind of writing is just is fun. It's fun to make a character or to create a character who has that kind of like neurotic thought pattern. It's a form of thinking that I do feel like I relate to. And then I just try to think like, okay, like how do I notch it up even more? How do I get this character to feel even like more obsessive than I've ever been. And it's sort of a space that I find, I don't know, almost, I won't say like, not entirely therapeutic to write a character like that, but at least I feel like some sort of release when I do write in that way.
And I think that might be all we have time for. But thank you so much, Alexandra and Katie, for letting us host you. We have books for sale on the website. We'll ship them straight to your home. And just thanks again. And thanks everybody for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for hosting this. And thank you everyone for being here and listening.